Hi, my name is Mark from Cannae Gaming, and this is the 7th video in a comprehensive tutorial series for War in Spain 1936 to 39, which was released in January by Matrix. A new theatre-level operational wargame that covers the Spanish Civil War in unprecedented depth, a conflict that served as the grim testing ground for the tactics and technologies of World War II. In part 3 we introduced Captain Bayo, who led the invasion. We are using his daily briefings with his staff to tell the story of my Balearics campaign. In part 6, Bayo arrived off the beaches at Santa Eularia on the island of Ibiza. The invasion situation is improving. We have a substantial force already on shore and are about to advance, with further units on the way. If you haven't seen the first 6 parts, I recommend that you go back and watch those first. Part 5, we first showed how to make a custom land combat unit, creating an artillery group. In part 6, we've created a barracks, HQ, and naval support unit. Today we will further consider how to handle reserves. And in part 6, we began to look at the logistics systems. We will now look in detail at the first part of that, focusing on the railways and industry. And just a quick note on the game, there has been the first major update issued with various bug fixes and a new scenario. If you have the game on your Matrix store account, then it's of course free to download. If this is what you were waiting for before purchasing the game, then it is now out of beta and is an official update. In part 6 we talked about the default supply-based replacement model, and so we looked at the basics of supply and how it affected getting replacements. There are 4 main elements to the supply system: the national capital, the railways, bases and the units. In this scenario it is Barcelona which acts as the national capital for the Republicans and Palma for the Nationalists. The logistics chain starts with the units which pull supply to themselves. The capital is the endpoint in meeting the demand. This is a very much simplified view. We will cover more details of the system in this part. In the replacement system, the supply base must have a certain amount of supplies for a unit to be provided with replacement devices. 25 supplies per device per day in a supply base connected to Barcelona, or 250 supplies in a supply base which is not connected, such as Santa Eularia. When that is the case, the replacement devices move directly from the national production pool to the unit. These are not moved explicitly on the map, they teleport. But the supplies in the supply base are moved explicitly by the logistics system. When we are using the default supply base model, we can still choose to have reserve units, and if these are set to distribute, then the game will take devices from there rather than the national pool. We created the Karl Marx barracks in part 6 before we ended the turn. That is here. And as expected, the reserve unit has been filled out by the replacement system. The unit is connected to Barcelona as its supply base, so it gets the advantage of the very high number of supplies that are in Barcelona. All of the squads we requested are now being trained in the barracks. Since we are discussing supplies, note that the barracks is not free. It needs supplies to feed the troops, 8 per day. If the devices were left in the pool, they would not consume supplies. While we are looking at this unit, we have covered a number of ways we can change the number and type of devices in a unit, as well as creating units with an entirely customized TOE. But we haven't yet covered merge. We can merge devices between 2 or more units. Let's create an empty unit using the new LCU button on the LCU sidebar, as we have seen before. Except now in the latest version, we don't have to minimize the LCU sidebar, then use the menu to restore it. We now have a new button on here marked SB for sidebar. That will toggle the visibility of the sidebar off and on. That's easier. This creates an RSV reserve unit in Barcelona, and an additional icon appears on the hex bar, but it has no devices yet. Let's give it a name, the Balearics Reserve. If I click on the merge button, then we get a screen where we can merge devices between two units, but we can't do anything with it. We can only merge devices when the two units involved have the same devices in their TOEs. Currently the new reserve unit has no TOE. Let's give it one. I'm going to assign it the Catalonia militia squads and give the unit 5 of them. Of course, this is just a list of devices that the unit could have. It does not currently have these devices. We would normally need to enable replacements and wait for the next day for the replacement system to provide the militia squads. But that's good enough for merge to now work. Click on it and we see the list of Catalonia militia on the left in green. If we had multiple devices in our TOE, we get to choose which type of device here. On the right of the screen is a list of units on the map, and at the top and highlighted green is the Aragon Theatre HQ, and all of its devices are listed, but they are all yellow. None of them match with our devices. The HQ has no Catalonia militia. If we scroll down, we see a lot of units marked red. These are too far away to be merged. In other words, they are not in Barcelona. You must be in the same hex and you must have some overlap of your TOE to be blue. Every unit listed in blue has some Catalonia militia. The one we want is the Karl Marx barracks, and the game immediately identifies that it's those militia that match and offers to transfer the devices. We can transfer matching devices into or out of a unit, but the reserve has none to give to the barracks, and we want to transfer them from the barracks to the new reserve unit. We can use the white arrow and add one at a time, or the yellow arrow and go straight to the maximum, which would be the 10 that the barracks have. Let's give the reserve unit 5 squads. That will leave the barracks still with 5. If we are happy with that, we click on the execute button. Now, when we go back, we see that the 5 slots we created in the TOE are filled up. We have the squads now because they were already on the map in Barcelona. We just transferred them between units. Nothing has come from the pool. We haven't cheated. There's still the same amount of squads on the map as there was before. But now when we go to the Karl Marx barracks, we see there is a shortfall in the Catalonia militia. It has 5 less than its own TOE tells it that it needs. And next turn the barracks will try to pull those squads from the pool. We could have created these 2 units on 4th of August and had them both fill from the pool without using merge. But it's useful to say that we can merge to move devices between units. The barracks will stay in Barcelona. That is a training unit. We want to keep it training squads for combat in the future. In reality, it will not have much effect on this scenario because a few weeks of training is not sufficient to matter. The 5 squads we released to the Balearics Reserve have had almost no training. That's unfortunate, but they are going with us on the ships to Mallorca. In fact, they may even go to Ibiza if Ubari or Bayo's columns suffer many losses. This is how we can ship replacement devices to the frontline combat units if we are playing with the more realistic device shipping model, or if we are playing with the default supply-based model and we want to ensure we can quickly replace destroyed or disabled squads fighting overseas, or just to control the flow of replacements. We have limited room on the ships that will carry our forces to Mallorca, but it would be a mistake to engage in major combat operations on the island without any reserves being available. At Barcelona, if we hover over the logistics details on the hex bar, we see additional information on the end of the pop-up. Plus 1200 supply per day, 800 fuel, and coal 1200. That only happens at Barcelona because it is the national capital in this scenario. These are generated every turn and are then added into the storage at Barcelona. Clicking on the name of the base gives us the base details window, and that shows that Barcelona has a supply capacity of 133,000 and a fuel capacity of 83,000. This is not a hard limit, it can store more, but anything over that is subject to spoilage. 2% lost per day, so that could quickly add up to a significant loss. Barcelona, in this respect, acts just like every other supply base. They all have storage, and a few have storage capacities this high, but most of the bases on the map have just the default storage for 5,000 supplies and 1,000 fuel. There is no mention in the game of storage facilities for coal, and I guess that's because in real life, coal has traditionally been stored outdoors, and very often not even in any sort of specialist containers, but just dumped in a pile on the ground. There's effectively no limit to how much you can store at a base because there is no spoilage of coal. But we have to be aware that coal is being generated and is handled by the logistics system. Even in the basic economy, coal is a third type of product that can be moved around the map, either automatically by the game using rail and trucks or by ships. We have seen ships loading supplies and fuel for our units, but we can also load coal onto cargo ships. This is an additional complexity of the system that we did not have in War in the Pacific. Coal is enabled as a movable product in the game so that the developers could implement two things. First, ships that consume coal, not fuel, and second, the railway system. We will cover railways in a later chapter in this part. In 1936, many older ships were still burning coal to heat their boilers to drive steam turbines, so we must ensure there is coal at the ports. If we look at the ships in the battleship squadron currently offshore at Santa Eularia, we see this even affects our warships. The Jaime Primero, built in 1912, still uses coal. The Libertad is a slightly more modern ship built in 1922 and uses fuel. The battleship squadron was only briefly involved in an engagement with a nationalist ship yesterday, and I think didn't fire any shells, but they fired a number the day before. And haven't been back to port for rearmament, you can see they've used some ammo. The game will take care of that for us when they get low on ammo, or low on coal or fuel, and will send the task force back to its home port at Valencia. There is no way that Santa Eularia can provide any of this. It is not a military port, so cannot rearm large warships. It cannot dock large ships like this to provide fuel or coal. And Santa Eularia has no coal anywhere. They must go back to Valencia. But first let's use some of the ammo they do still have on board and change their mission to bombardment. We can cancel their order to follow the landing flotilla. This will mean they will stop performing escort duties, but if we send them to the hex offshore from Ibiza town, just 10 miles away, they are still close enough to react to any enemy ships in the area. We use these controls to set the bombardment details. We can stand quite far off the coast. We have the range on our guns to even be outside of the Ibiza hex. But 3 days into the scenario, and we have not seen a single nationalist plane. You haven't seen all of the combat animations, and some of them are really quick to be able to take in what they are showing. But the combat reports would tell us if there were nationalist planes spotted. Ibiza is also not protected by coastal gun batteries. We can safely come quite close to shore. 2 kiloyards, 2,000 yards seems close enough. The battleship has 8 main guns, 2 forward, 2 in the rear, and 4 centrally positioned. 305mm guns are 12 inches. But it also has 10 102mm 4-inch guns on either side, so that's quite a broadside. Except in practice, these 4-inch guns were pretty ineffective in naval combat because they were very low to the waterline and didn't have a big arc of fire. The default is to fire at any airfield 100%. Let's not just reduce that, let's remove it completely. We can be sure there's no planes at the airfield, and while I am not certain that we could make use of that airfield ourselves later, let's not damage it. Same argument for the port, except there we definitely do not want damage. We need that port to get off the island in a few days. We don't want to carry out repairs. Striking 100% on any land combat units in the hex is what we want. Though, as noted, we still have no good reconnaissance of the nationalist forces in the town. We know they are there. A few dozen 12-inch shells into their base should shake them up. Remember from part 5 that Elliot Paul told us that in real life, in early August, Republican planes flew over the island but didn't drop bombs. They dropped leaflets asking the garrison to surrender. And they didn't bombard the town. At this stage, the Republicans didn't have the Jaime Primero and Libertad. Around this date, they were still to the south, off Malaga. The battleship squadron would not arrive in the Balearics until later in the month. But the Balearics invasion force did have destroyers and other gunboats.
After noon over the city of Ibiza, 4 planes came wheeling in the casual and non-military fashion that marked them as Spanish. Then 2 of them headed for Santa Eularia and 2 for San Antonio. The planes soared over the main street, turned, and let drop a stream of messages. They zigzagged erratically, were awkward and larger. Newspapers, someone shouted. Newspapers from Valencia, on the front page large headlines. Today we shall take Ibiza. It was announced that an expedition from Valencia and Barcelona, with 1 transport, 2 destroyers, 4 submarines, 6 hydroplanes, 5,000 men under the command of Don Alfredo Bayo, captain of aviation, had set out from Valencia amid the cheers of an admiring populace. That the plan was to take Ibiza first, then proceed to Majorca. The morning of August 6th passed without incident. In the afternoon I was playing checkers with Juanito, when the bombardment of Ibiza began. We heard the rumble of the naval guns and the sharper explosion of bombs dropped from the planes. Juanito and I listened to the ominous cannonade. It was not a heavy bombardment, perhaps 24 shells and half a dozen bombs.
Let's return to our logistics discussion regarding coal. As well as some ships, the railways can consume coal. They don't have to. It is possible that railways can consume fuel or electricity, because in the 1930s there were already some countries with electric railways and diesel trains. The developers have produced a flexible engine to cover these situations, but in one Spain we have steam trains powered by burning coal. This is part of making it so that the logistics system is not free and is based on historic infrastructure. The supplies don't just teleport from base to base as they did in War in the Pacific. There are 4 specific limiting factors. The rail tracks can be a bottleneck. There's only a certain amount of rolling stock. We need to have coal to operate the rolling stock. And train depots need to be available. We can see this in Barcelona by clicking on this row of icons right at the bottom of the hex bar. These show the components of the economic system operating in the hex. The type we are interested in is the train depot. The train depot consumes coal. The interface suggests you might also need some fuel, but I think that is the alternative if you have diesel trains rather than an additional amount. The scenario files seem to show all of the train depots across Spain and North Africa use coal only. Coal is generated every day in Barcelona and then needs to be moved to the other rail depots so they can use it. This always means that a proportion of our rail network is being used to move coal. The rail system moves supplies, fuel, coal and troops. If we choose to use trains for strategic movements of units, then that takes away the rolling stock from moving supply, fuel and coal. If some enterprising modder implements an advanced economic model in War in Spain, then I would expect coal would be consumed by heavy industry, not just by the railways. But we don't have that. We have a relatively simple economy. And before we go further, let me attempt to clarify some of the perhaps unnecessary complexity that the developers have caused by having all of these different options in the game engine, and which is carried forward into the manual. This is section 9.3 on supplies, and it tells us there are 8 supply types. There are not. Barcelona generates only supplies fuel and coal, as we saw. The default on the hex bar is to show the numbers of supplies, fuel and coal stored in the hex. We can click on these amounts and cycle through other information. There are 106,000 supplies. Click on it and we see the same number for air ammo, LCU ammo, aviation gas, then back to supply. So we have a generic supply that covers 4 of the 8 primary categories listed here, abstracted as one single movable resource referred to just as supplies. Then clicking on fuel with 30,000 tons, naval fuel, fuel coal, and aviation gas again. So 4 categories listed, but fuel for trucks etc. and naval fuel are just abstracted as one generic fuel. Aviation gas, as we already saw, is abstracted as part of the generic supplies. And fuel coal refers to the coal used by ships and is just part of the generic coal. Lastly, clicking on coal cycles through oil, which barely exists in this game, and resources, supply we already covered, and fuel, then back to coal. We will look at resources and oil shortly. The game engine allows for the possibility that an advanced economy could be implemented, and there could be the 8 categories here. The advanced economy can also have heavy industry, but there are none on the map. This is not a choice that you can make in the advanced preferences. The scenario files set the game not to use the advanced economy. The manual dedicates many pages to something that War in Spain does not implement. I applaud the developers for working on this aspect of the game engine and making it available to modders, and we can see the more strategic choices we will probably get in future games. Nevertheless, this makes the interface and manual overly complex. The manual talks about providing aviation fuel to air groups, for example, at 5 different places, and only in one hints that you might not have aviation fuel. In the section I referred to on modding of the advanced economy, it says, quotes, air can have a dedicated aviation fuel. It doesn't say that the game does not actually have dedicated aviation fuel, and you cannot change that except with a mod. The latest update has made this even worse. We had a basic but understandable interface here when we pressed the hotkey Y. Not pretty, but functional. Now we get this. The section of the manual on production provides the warning that it is for modders. It then says the stock production model uses, and then lists the 8. But in fact, only 5 of these are implemented in War in Spain. Even in the main campaign there are no oil fields. But we do have refineries and coal mines. We have a button on the top menu to show industry overview. We see by default a long list of all the locations with manpower. But if we select on the left coal, then we get to see the single location with a coal mine, Puebla de Valbona. Using the list of bases, we get to see it is a very small location on the map near Valencia, easily overlooked. But it has the coal mine icon on the bottom row of the hex bar. That shows that it is level 5 and produces 100 tons of coal per day. In the main campaign, this is in fact the smallest of 5 coal mines in the game. There is one in Catalonia close to the French border that is level 25, producing 500 tons, and another in Almeria, level 35, producing 700 per day. Both are in Republican territory in August 1936, but just outside of the boundaries of the map for the tutorial scenario. So the developers have simulated the access to this coal by providing 1200 per day in Barcelona. In the main campaign, you get no coal generated at the national capital, Madrid. In fact, you get nothing generated at Madrid. Everything has to be produced by your industry or imported. Martorell is another very small location on the map near Barcelona. There is another way to find the industries. If we use the hotkey Y for Yankee, then we get this window that I mentioned earlier where we can select the industry type we want to see marked on the map. And if we ignore all of those advanced economy options, then when we select refinery, we see Martorell marked. It is level 1 and can only process 10 tons of oil per day. It would generate from that 9 tons of fuel and 1 ton of supplies. In the main campaign, this is the smallest of 3 Republican-held refineries, but refineries need oil to operate, and oil is produced by oil fields. There are no oil fields in Spain, nor in the Spanish colonies in North Africa, and oil is not auto-generated in Barcelona in this scenario, nor in the main campaign in Madrid. However, this is not a choice between economic models, nor an oversight by the developers, but a deliberate reflection of the historic situation of Spain. But I don't think you see this is clearly explained anywhere. The absence of oil in the Spanish economy is in fact an important strategic element in the game. When we look at the industry of Martorell on the 7th of August, then we see there is no oil in the hex. Our industry therefore cannot generate fuel, but in the Balearics tutorial, 800 tons of fuel is auto-generated every day for free for us at Barcelona. This simulates the arrival of tankers from friendly nations. You do not get this in the main campaign. The only way to get fuel is to import it, or import some oil and then refine it. You will need to organize that yourself in the main campaign. We have several large tankers to use for this purpose. We see them at anchorage in some ports. There are resource centers all around the map. The game generates resources at these, so resources are not generated every day at Barcelona. It is another thing that can be moved around by the rail network, taking up rolling stock and consuming coal. As resources are consumed by light industry and possibly by manpower, then resources often don't move very far because there are usually light industries in the same hex or close by. And then, if I have understood this confusing situation correctly, and I absolutely might not have done, then the light industry that is in most towns and cities generates supplies as well as the supplies being generated in Barcelona. The manual claims that coal is consumed by light industries, but the game interface does not show that. It seems to be confusing light and heavy industry because we can probably expect certain heavy industries to require coal in the advanced economy. If we look at Santa Eularia, then we have 3 economic icons on the hex bar. These are manpower centers, light industries, and resource centers. If we click on these icons, we used to see just 8 of the possible industry types. In other words, the ones that are in the game. Now we see even more from the advanced economy that we don't have. Santa Eularia has 6 resource centers, and we can imagine this representing enterprises carrying out timber, farming, fishing, etc. These generate 60 resources, 10 resources per resource center. The manual refers to something it calls agriculture points, but from the description it appears to be referring to the resources. This looks like the developers started with the idea of having agriculture specifically represented and then broadened the category to cover other natural resources, but didn't update that section of the manual. Similarly, the manual at one point refers to manpower centres generating manpower points, but the game uses the term workers. Workers are generated by manpower centres, where the manpower centres are the cities and towns. This makes sense. The higher the population of a city, the more people are available for working on certain infrastructure projects, or to draft into your army. But the manual says it is generated at a rate of 10 to 1, when it is clearly 1 to 1. One worker for every 1 point or level of manpower centres. And that's a particularly scary warning about your nation being starved into surrender if you don't run the agriculture industry and feed your population, when there is no agriculture or food visible anywhere in the game. I see no evidence that the resources generated by resource centres are consumed by manpower centres to generate workers. The interface does not say that. It clearly shows manpower centres do not consume anything. We can imagine in real life that cities consume food and other raw materials, products of light industries, coal for heating, and fuel for vehicles. But none of that is represented in the game, and perhaps rightly so when we are running a war game, not an economic simulator. If this warning in the manual applies to anyone using a mod that has introduced the advanced economy into their game, then all well and good. But the manual should make this explicit. Anyway, the resource centres at Santa Eularia generate 60 resources, and the 2 light industries there can consume just 4 resources. Most of the resources produced at Santa Eularia cannot be processed there, and normally would move to Ibiza town and then need to be shipped to the mainland for industry to turn it into finished products. Elliot Paul recounts in his book how the island was not only cut off from the mainland for news, but also the ships carrying goods, both raw materials and manufactured goods, were not sailing. Very quickly it meant some businesses could not operate, and this badly affected the local economy. The small amount of light industry there produces 4 supplies, so capture of the town appears to be generating some supplies that our units in the beachhead can consume, but very small, not enough to make a significant difference. So, to summarise this, there are 5 things that can be moved by the rail network in this scenario: supplies, fuel, coal, resources, and units undergoing strategic movement. In the main campaign you may also have oil. And to move things by rail, we must use rail units like this one at Barcelona Bordeta. It has 110 devices. Each device can carry 50 tons. Therefore, every day the rolling stock in the unit can carry 5,500 tons. If we look here on the list of all LCUs and filter by logistics and arrange by type, we see all of our log R units, rail logistics units. The Barcelona unit is the largest of the 5 we have. In total in this scenario, we can move just over 10,000 tons of stuff by rail. But if we add up all the supplies, coal and fuel generated at Barcelona each day, then it is just 3,200 tons. That suggests we have more than enough rolling stock in the game. If you have experienced problems, let me know in the comments. This is a diagram of part of the rail network near Barcelona, with 3 bases all having train depots. For supplies to move to Tàrrega, the loading-unloading facilities are at train depots. The rail unit does not have to be located at one of these two, but it still must be at a train depot so it can be provided with coal. This scenario starts with the rail unit at Bordetta in the hex next to Barcelona. Bordetta is a train depot but is not as big as Barcelona. Specifically, it is a level 10 depot while Barcelona is 120. The rule is simple. To support one rail device, you need one level of depot. Therefore, Bordetta can support the operation of only 10 rail devices, probably enough to take all the supplies we want to Tàrrega. But the rail unit has 110 devices. It should not be left at Bordetta if we are to get maximum use from it. And I will move it to nearby Barcelona, which can support up to 120 devices. The size of the Barcelona and Tàrrega train depots also affects the time to load and unload. We can expect the loading at Barcelona is very quick, but Tàrrega might be a problem if we want to deliver a lot of supplies there, though you can improve train depots using supplies and workers to expand them. The rail units have a range of 200 miles around 60 hexes. That means this rail unit can reach Alicante, the place further south on this map attached by rail. The tooltip tells us that Alicante is 41 hexes away. It's not a problem even in the main campaign, because journeys do not have to be carried out in one movement. Supplies, fuel and resources could be moved from Barcelona to Tarragona, then from Tarragona to Valencia, then from Valencia to Madrid, or even more steps, with the movements further down the line from Barcelona handled by other R units at different train depots, and the range applies to each movement. We are not concerned about rail in this scenario. Our biggest concern is getting supplies and fuel to Santa Eularia, and that is an entirely different logistical challenge with ships. As long as we have railways connecting our cities on the mainland in war in Spain, then we can expect that the flow of supplies, coal, resources, and men and equipment is not going to be a problem. This is not Libya nor Burma, and the rail lines, rolling stock, depots and coal should be available for our needs. The inclusion of much of this is clearly designed around future games and the major limitations that occurred in other theatres of war. Yet, that does not mean we can ignore this. The rail link from Barcelona to Valencia is strategically important, and the first major update from the developers features a new scenario covering the Battle of the Ebro. After the nationalists reached the coast and cut this railway line, the Republicans launched a major offensive to try to recapture it, and the scenario covers that. We mentioned in part 6 that there are 4 main elements to the logistics system: the national capital, the railways, bases, and the units themselves. We have covered 2 of these in very much more detail, maybe more detail than the Balearics campaign warrants, yet you need to be aware of this in other scenarios. We have seen the role of the train depot and RR units, and we've covered the role of coal in the system, both to operate the trains and for some ships, and we've seen other aspects of the industry. We have seen that despite the absence of an advanced economy in this game, the features for it are present in the game engine. They can be seen in the user interface and are referred to in the manual. This can be confusing to understand what is included and what is not. So it is necessary, I think, to cover much of this to help our general understanding of the game. Even if industry, production of fuel, etc. are the least of our problems to capture Ibiza. This is a tutorial on the game as a whole, as well as an AAR on the specifics of the Balearics campaign. We need to cover the other parts of the supply system. What happens when supplies and fuel leave the rail network? And I will do that in part 8. Let's put some of this together If we go to Tarragona, then we can see it has a reasonable stockpile of coal. Tarragona is a level 5 port, which started the game on 4th of August with about 1,000 tons of coal. So it has already increased its stockpile by 800 tons. Tarragona is a node in the rail network, linking along the coast from Alicante, Valencia, Castellón, and then to Barcelona. The surplus between the required and stockpile is probably just as we see the game moving coal around the network. We can't see where the coal came from or which rail unit brought it. Tarragona is also an endpoint in the sense that it is an important port with a number of coal-powered ships operating from there. The game is aware of the need for coal at Tarragona and has set the required level accordingly to pull coal to the base. There is a rail unit at Tarragona with 8 railcar devices, and Tarragona has a level 10 train depot. So it has the capability to support the rail unit. It's a suitable location to provide the trains with coal and for loading and unloading of the rail cars at the port. And it seems that without us doing anything during the last 3 days, the game has pulled coal to Tarragona. If we open the base information, we can see the current stockpile of coal and the required amount. The game says that Tarragona requires 1,500 tons. It can therefore make available for other bases to request about 300 tons of coal. In fact, they could request more, as we have not fixed in place the stockpile. Stockpiling is set to off. If we set that to on, then we can force the game not to reduce it below the current level. We can also tell the game that we want it to build up coal at this base. Using the requested buttons, we can add 1,000 tons to the required amount. And this goes pink to show that the current level is now lower than the required. The game will then start to pull extra coal to Tarragona. Request 3,000, the numbers go red. The game is showing us that the current level in Tarragona is far less than the required level we set. The game will then try to allocate even more rail cars to bring in coal to Tarragona. We have this task force I created off camera. The 3 AKL light cargo ships are coal powered. They have 2 kinds of storage: their internal storage of coal for their own engines and their cargo holds. Internally they can hold about 100 tons. That is enough to give them an endurance that could just about cross the Atlantic. They are not going to burn through 1,800 tons of coal very quickly, making short trips in the Mediterranean. Now, let's say that there were low coal stockpiles at Mahon, and we want to have a steady flow of coal to there. The ships have cargo holds that can be filled with coal. Our capacity is here, nearly 700 tons. Let's select Load Other and then see that there are the 1,800 tons of coal at Tarragona available to be loaded. We would be loading nearly half that on these ships, and if we did, that would reduce the level at Tarragona, and the game will adjust the rail units to try to maintain the levels. Remember, rail cars hold 50 tons each, so even if all of the rail cars at Tarragona are dedicated to bringing coal to the port, we would have a hard time maintaining the levels at Tarragona if we shipped 700 tons from the port every day, which we're not going to do. Let's set the destination of the task force as Mahon. We have seen so far that we've had to direct very specifically the movements of every task force, except the warships, when we put them on patrol. The subs, for instance, remain on patrol, and we have not had to interact with them directly each day. We have something similar to automate these sort of convoys. Click on TF routing and we have a set of commands in the top right. These are not very self-explanatory, but they are the automatic convoy system. This is an entirely different mechanism from war in the Pacific, where for the Japanese it was always assumed that the automatic convoys would move goods to or from the home islands. This system is more flexible, and we can just set the route target as Mahon. Then we need to set the export and import, which are both set as none. Click on no export, it goes green, and then we can set the options for the goods we want to export, what we want to send out from the port to the destination, and we want to send coal. It's inefficient to run the convoys empty on the way back, so we can have them pick up resources if we want and bring that back to the mainland. We can now see that under TF routing it says repetitive transport, and this convoy will not only repeatedly run, but there will be some AI management of it. The game will pause the convoy if the base stockpiles fall too low. We have more work involved in setting up an auto-convoy for ships to move products like coal than we have in moving these around the mainland. The movement of trains bringing products from Barcelona to Tarragona just happens with almost no input from us. The game does all of the hard work in deciding which of the rail units to use to move the coal, and we never see that level of detail. We should simply say that as long as we have enough coal being generated, that it flows from Barcelona and the single coal mine on the map to everywhere it is needed, including to the port at Tarragona, and is then loaded onto the convoy and sent to Mahon. Once we set up a convoy like this, then in theory we can also forget about it, though the nationalists and their fascist allies might have something to say on that. Note, if we look at Mahon, its base information tells us that it has zero requirement for resources. We can probably take it all on the convoy and the game will not stop us. That's fine because the island of Minorca generates far more resources than its own light industry can convert to supplies. But of course, there is no need for coal at Mahon in this scenario. The developers have given us a large stockpile already, so the automatic coal convoy would probably not take any coal there, and I don't really need to be concerned about those resources building up in Mahon. We could cancel the request. Let's instead send our task force to Santa Eularia, and that will cancel the auto-convoy to Mahon. So now let's repeat those steps. Make the route target Santa Eularia. Export supply, but leave it as no import. Now we have an automatic convoy that will regularly deliver about 600 tons of supplies to the island. And notice, this is far more efficient than making individual journeys. It will never stop at a port waiting for midnight for us to give it orders, and we cannot forget to tell it what to do. The first action is the battleship squadron bombarding Ibiza town. That causes casualties, including a number of squads destroyed. Then nothing until we see the AM air phase at 600 hours with a couple of attacks by our planes on ships. At 1100 we drop into a naval engagement involving our destroyers. Yesterday they had escorted the ships carrying Bayo's column from Barcelona. Overnight they had been at Santa Eularia. Off camera I had set them back on patrol in the Majorca Channel. Now towards the end of the hour we can see the nationalist ships on the map. They were in the area, just not spotted by us. We scored some hits on one of the ships before the end of the hour. Immediately we go back into another engagement and can continue the attack. It's in the middle of the day with good weather and visibility is fine. The enemy ships can't easily escape. This continues through to the evening and we get several reports of enemy ships being badly damaged and on fire. And then we get a report of a light cargo ship being sunk by a sub after dark at 2100 hours. The report shows losses on the ship with numbers of squads, vehicles and guns, so that ship was carrying a land combat unit. It seems clear that once we land on the island of Ibiza, the nationalist AI tries to reinforce the garrison in the town. Then we have the report that Uribari's column captured Cala de San Vicente, which was undefended. I don't think that we just arrived at 2300 hours, just that changes of control of bases get reported at that time each day. We'll look further at what has happened at Bayo's brief in part 8. In his book, Elliot Paul recounts how the day after the newspapers were dropped, leaflets were dropped over Santa Eularia, warning that the town would be bombarded and the population should evacuate. Elliot Paul and most of the townspeople slept in the woods that night, but there was no bombardment. The following morning, a little way from the village, they heard shots.
A rifle shot, another. We went on. We saw a figure, gun and uniform, by the bridge. Guardia. Apparently nothing had happened. Guardia still in town. No landing after bluff bombardment, sick and tired. The sentry moved his arm and beckoned us to come on. Guardia, hell, it's a Spanish sailor, not only a sailor from Formentera, but one I had known for several years. A steward on one of the Palma boats. The sentry explained a young man had come riding down the hill about a mile a minute, and when asked to halt had tumbled off and run. He had fired twice to scare him. You'd better take care of his bicycle, the sailor said. The militia'll be here before long. The sailor walked with Pep and me to a small white house by the river bank, and there yelled to his officer, a powerfully built man of medium height in white collarless shirt and military trousers, binoculars in hand, motioned us to come to him. He greeted me in Spanish. Then Pep mentioned that I was an American. He genuinely smiled. He spoke American. Captain Bayo learned to fly in Ohio and Michigan.
In this part, we looked at the ability to use the merge function to move devices between units in the same hex. This can help us make our own custom units or to manage the devices in the default units. We've been looking further at aspects of the logistics system, and we saw that coal is used by some ships and by our rail units. The rail units have to be based at a suitable train depot before they can move products. In the economic model, coal is generated by coal mines and moved to the train depots and ports by rail. We have resource centres on the map, and these generate resources which are then consumed by light industries, and the light industries all around the map generate supplies. We saw the difficulties Spain has in terms of the lack of oil fields and fuel refineries, so that you will need to import fuel in the main campaign. But in the Balearics tutorial scenario, we have fuel generated automatically every day at Barcelona. I showed how to create auto-convoys and established one to take supplies to Santa Eularia. Off camera, I will do the same for fuel to the island. This auto-convoy mechanism is what we would use to import fuel with our tankers from foreign ports in the main campaign. And we saw how to set up a bombardment mission for the battleship squadron. If you found this video helpful, please consider liking the video and leaving a comment. I would love to hear how you've managed your economy. And don't forget to subscribe to Cannae Gaming and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next train to Barcelona. I've been Mark from Cannae Gaming, and I will see you back in the Balearics in part 8.